Esteemed speakers, dear participants, it is a great pleasure to welcome you from around the world to this 60-minute webinar under the theme Nicaea and the Peace Witness of the Church, jointly organized by the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches and the Mennonite World Conference. I am Father Vasile Octavian Mihok, serving as Program Executive for Ecumenical Relations and Faith and Order at the World Council of Churches. Today's event is part of a webinar series preparing for the World Conference on Faith and Order, which will take place this October in Egypt under the theme Where Now for Visible Unity. These webinars, organized in collaboration with various Christian or communions, address important theological, ecclesiological, and missiological questions, shaping contemporary conversations on Christian unity. They are designed to foster dialogue and reflection, offering theological and ecumenical insights that will enrich our gathering in Egypt. Recordings of previous webinars on topics such as the common date of Easter, the Bishop of Rome and Christian unity, the joint Lutheran Orthodox statement on the Filioque, and the Anglican perspectives on church unity are available on the WCC YouTube channel. We are truly honored to have with us today Reverend Professor Dr. Fernando Enns, who will serve as moderator. Dr. Enns holds a chair in Peace, Theology, and Ethics at the Free University of Amsterdam, where he also directs the Amsterdam Center for Religion, Peace, and Justice Studies. He additionally serves as Professor of Theology of Peace Churches at the University of Hamburg. Born in Curitiba, Brazil, he belongs to the historic Peace Church of the Mennonites, where he was ordained, and he is vice chair of the Association of Mennonite Congregations in Germany. Dr. Enns has been a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches since 1998. Among his many publications, special attention may be made of the Peace Church and the Ecumenical Community, and Ecumenism and Peace from Theory and Practice to Pilgrimage and Companionship. Before handing over to our moderator, I would like to encourage you to share your comments and reflections in the chat and to post your questions in the Q&A section. You will see at the bottom of this Zoom that you have two options, chat and Q&A. Make sure that you include and you write your questions in the Q&A section. Once again, very warm welcome to each of you, and Dr. Enns, over to you.
Thank you so much, Father Octavian. Thank you very much for inviting us, for hosting us, for creating this space for a very meaningful discussion that we're having in the series of the webinars. Before I introduce the speakers that we have with us, let me say a few words about this very specific webinar that we are doing today. It is the Nicene Creed and the Peace Witness of the Church. That's the title of this webinar. And what we want to do is we want to explore the significance of the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea from a Mennonite/Anabaptist perspective and how this influences the peace witness of the Church. Now, let me say a few words before we start this discussion, a few words about who are these Anabaptists, why are they called the Peace Church, who are the Mennonites, because it is a minority stream within the Christian family. So a few words for introduction might be well placed here. The Anabaptists, let's start with that term, the Anabaptists are the third stream within the Reformation of the 16th century in Europe. So next to Lutheran and Calvinist stream, there we have this Anabaptist stream. It was always labeled as the radical Reformation. Why? Because they were those who went the farthest in their attempt to reform the medieval church in Western Europe. Now, they pleaded, for example, for a clear separation of church and state, and they reintroduced adult baptism as the right way to do baptism, so that individuals would understand what they confess personally in their faith and then being baptized. Now, I could say more about that. What is important here is this provided reason enough for the magisterial churches to label them as Anabaptists. So this was not the name that they chose for themselves, but Anabaptists, the re-baptizers, asking their governments to persecute these radical reformers. So it was a rough start of this movement because we have a history full of martyrdom. Men and women were persecuted, were burned, were killed by the help also of the other Christians. Now, as we sit here as an ecumenical family, it's always good to be reminded that it has not always been as peaceful as it is today here. Some streams of that survived, and nowadays we have a variety of churches in our ecumenical family that draw their origins back to this movement of the Radical Reformation. One of them is the Mennonites. Now that's the next term, Mennonite, named after one of the early leaders, Menno Simons. Menno Simons was one of those leaders who favored a life in nonviolence, nonviolence becoming one of the key terms that makes this stream of Christianity really distinct. By the way, this year, 2025, marks the 500 years commemoration of this Anabaptist movement, and we just celebrated that with Mennonite World Conference. Now, I've already said a little bit about the peace witness, the nonviolence. That's the third term that appears here. Mennonites, together with Quakers, with Church of the Brethren and others, are named peace churches. That is a terminology that came up actually in the 1930s within the ecumenical movement when discussions were boiling up on war and peace. And these traditions came together, Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, Quakers, in order to figure out what is our contribution as peace churches, as those who hold the nonviolent stream within the ecumenical movement. What can we give to the ecumenical movement? What can we receive? So it is quite important to note that nonviolence and other aspects of ethical living, ethical life, as disciples of Christ would become very essential and actually an identity marker of these streams. That is important to note in order maybe also to have a bit of a framework and a background of the speakers of this tradition that we have here today. So we want to discuss with this tradition in this larger ecumenical family, is there a specific view, a specific interpretation, specific questions that representatives of these traditions have for the Nicene Creed, or better to say, how we commemorate, how we remember the Nicene Creed. So it's a joy for me to introduce our speakers here. First of all, let me introduce to you Dr. Nancy Elizabeth Bedford. Welcome, Nancy. Dr. Bedford has been Georgia Harkness Professor of Theology at Garrett Theological Seminary in Evanston since 2003. Previously, she taught theology at the Instituto Universitario ISEDET and Seminario Internacional Teológico Bautista, both in Buenos Aires in Argentina. She has written, co-written, edited many books, lots of articles. Very interesting is her background, her research background, because she focuses on global feminist theories and theologies, Latin American liberation and decolonial theologies, also Latin theologies in North America, whiteness, racism, whole food, plant-based theologies and praxis, theologies of nonviolent resistance, rooted in the Anabaptist tradition. Voila, there you go. Liberating readings of scripture and the theological tradition, and the re-articulation of classical doctrinal loci, such as Christology and pneumatology, from the perspective of a critical, artistic, and poetic reason. Now, I would say she is very well placed as one of these representatives from this radical reformation, as it was called, in the 16th century, but still alive in the 21st century. Welcome, Nancy. Great to have you. Then we have, as a second person here, Andrew. Welcome. Dr. Andrew Suderman serves as the Director of Global Partnership for Mennonite Mission Network and as the Secretary of Mennonite World Conference Peace Commission. He's also an associate professor in theology, peace, and mission at Eastern Mennonite University in the United States. Although born in Canada, Andrew has spent many years living outside of Canada, a combined total of 10 years in Latin America. He speaks Spanish, 7 years in South Africa, and 8 years and counting in the United States. Through all of these different roles, Andrew seeks to explore how we embody our theological convictions and how our lived experience and journey affects the way in which we understand God's work and mission in the world. Again, very much it is how we live, how the way of living. You can sense the Mennonite background here. Throughout his life, Andrew has sought ways to balance the academy and classroom on the one hand, while also finding ways of participating in different struggles and lived ministerial and practical experiences on the other. He has worked with offenders and ex-offenders in both provincial and federal penitentiaries in Canada, supervised a 54-bed homeless shelter, and walked with and learned from South Africans as they continue to wrestle with their painful history of apartheid. All right, Andrew, in theology, you have done your PhD also on South Africa's Kairos document and the ecclesiology, and I had the privilege to be one of your counterparts in the defense, which was really a joy and very enriching. Welcome, Andrew. And next to that, as a third speaker, we have Andres Pacheco Lozano. Dr. Andres Pacheco Lozano is a lecturer and a researcher at the Mennonite Seminary in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, connected to the School of Religion and Theology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Center for Peace Church Theology at the University of Hamburg in Germany. With me, I have the pleasure to call him a colleague, a friend, a companion. Andres is also co-director of the Amsterdam Center for Religion and Peace and Justice Studies, and he finished his PhD at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam in 2020 on the theme, now listen carefully, very much ecumenical oriented, towards the theology of reconciliation, a pilgrimage of justice and peace to heal broken relations in Colombia. So originally from Colombia, having grown up there, now teaching and living in Europe, he brings huge experience in the peace work, peace and justice work from Colombia. Andres is serving currently as a chair of the Peace Commission of the Mennonite World Conference and is a member of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches. So here we have a person who is actually very much involved in the Faith and Order Commission as a representative of the Mennonites, of the Peace Church tradition, as a representative from Latin America, but also as a Mennonite, he's of course very well equipped to speak here in this webinar. Welcome, Andres. Thanks a lot, friends, for joining and for making time for us today. We want to do this in a hopefully dynamic conversation. So it's not a lecture from one side, but more like engaging in a conversation. And my proposal is that we first look at the content of the Nicene Creed, because this is very important, of course, before we talk about context, political circumstances, and so on. The Anabaptists of the 16th century, as I mentioned, they did not really question the creed itself. Nicaea, it was actually very important for them always to make sure that they confirm the ecumenical symbols or the creeds of the ancient church and that they stand on that ground. So there was no question about that. Although sometimes they were asked, are these really true believers? Are they really part of the tradition and so on? So their orthodoxy, you could say, was questioned at times. Now, I would like to ask you, what is it in the creed that you yourself, in your theological research, in your personal journey, in your church, what do you hold as a very important content that speaks to you up until this day, and that is really key when you read the creed? And let's start with Andrew first here.
Yeah, well, good morning, and thank you very much for that introduction and also for that question. I think it's a very good question because I think one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about this particular year is that this isn't just the 500-year anniversary of the Anabaptist movement. It's also the 1700-year anniversary of the Nicene Creed. And so why is it that this creed continues to speak to us? Why is it that we continue to find it meaningful and something that continues to shape our ecclesial or our church identity? I think one of the things that I find, and it's very difficult to kind of try to answer this, and I'm not sure if it is possible to try to answer this without taking a couple steps back in order to understand the broader context of the creed itself. I think that it's fascinating and it's interesting to see the way in which the early church at this time, they're still trying to get their feet under them, and they're still trying to understand who the relationship between, for example, this person that they believe in and that they follow, what the relationship is between this man, Jesus, with the broader the broader divine being that they understand as God. And so in this creed itself, you find this attempt at trying to unpack and trying to understand and wrestle with this interrelationship that exists within the Godhead between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so I'm not sure if I'm frozen. There we go. And so this, in kind of fancy terms, fancy theological terms, this is kind of the perichoretic relationship, right? The perichoresis, the relationship, the inner relationship within the Godhead. And I think that that element is a very significant component within the creed itself in how this early community was trying to understand this person of Jesus, right? The economic expression of God within this world, recognizing and remembering what Karl Rahner, a 20th century Catholic theologian, said, that the economic trinity, the manifestation of God in relationship to history, is also an example of the immanent trinity and vice versa. But it's this interplay of how, and this attempt at trying to understand how these three components relate to one another. And for me, this is one of those, I think of, for example, in John, in Jesus's farewell discourse, John chapters 14 to 17, where we find another example of this kind of attempt at trying to understand this interplay between these kind of components. In this farewell discourse, there's this interesting kind of component that the author of John articulates as, this in relationship to truth. The spirit is in relationship to truth, the spirit of truth, in fact, right? There's also Jesus, Jesus is the way and the truth. And then later on in chapter 16 and 17, there's an idea that God the Father is a revealer and participator of truth. But within this particular, within this discourse in John, there's this audacious statement that as Jesus is praying, there's this audacious statement that Jesus invites us into participation within the divine, that we may participate in God as Jesus and Father are together as one. And I think that interparticipation, that interdwelling, that perichoretic relationship is, I think, very essential for how we understand ourselves, how we understand the church, and the church in relationship to one another as well. Catherine Lacuna, she was a feminist theologian, I think dealt and kind of explored this really well, and highlighting the way in which the creed began to get, or was interpreted from the Greek to the Latin, shifted some of the significant interrelationship and the way we understand that indwelling between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As the creed went in its interpretation from Greek to Latin, there was an abstraction that was introduced through the Latin, as they was talking about and translated this notion of ousia, or hypostasis, as substance, as opposed to personhood, right? And so she talks about how within that interpretation, right, and interpreting it as substance, all of a sudden we find that God's non-relationality becomes primary. In other words, that personhood element becomes secondary if it becomes important at all in terms of the way in which we understand God and the inner relationship within God, right? So she says, for example, and she kind of highlights the Cappadocian fathers provide an important kind of counterbalance to that interpretation. She says that the Cappadocians rather made person rather than substance the primary ontological category in which to understand God and God's relations, both immanent and economic. And this is, I think, very significant because it highlights the way in which the ecclesial forms, the church forms, have taken hold of that inner relationship of God and structured themselves. And so we have this difference between, for example, a more hierarchical understanding or a more hierarchical church structure, as opposed to a more communal, relational church model. And that has, I think, a significant component or a significant kind of aspect of how we interpret peace and how peace, in terms of how we relate to one another, is centralized in terms of how we understand God.
Thank you.
That's, I think, one of the things that I would highlight.
That's great. No, that's great, Andrew, because it helps us to understand, this relational, communal aspect, as you say, within the Trinity, how much that speaks actually to a Mennonite ecclesiology, and puts a foundation to that. Nancy, what is it for you that you celebrate and cherish in the content of this creed?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Andrew, for that presentation as well. Well, one of the things that come to mind for me is just that they were figuring things out along the way at that time. It wasn't so set in stone, right? Andrew kind of hinted at that when what he just said. And I really appreciate that aspect of the whole Nicene process. We don't really know exactly how many people were there, what happened. Our sources are not very strong as to a description, but there is a letter that Eusebius of Caesarea, who later writes about this in a kind of propagandistic way. But right at that time, he writes his community saying, well, this is why I, in the end, upheld this statement. And he talks about the fact that there was a lot of discussion in the meetings, which I find great. It was dynamic. So I think one thing that I hold to is just how dynamic these discussions were. And this is not about regulating and setting in stone, but it's trying to figure out along the way how to express the centrality of Christology. And that's what I would also uphold, the centrality of Christology. They realize this, if we don't get this right, the whole thing doesn't make any sense. So if you talk about articulus stantis et cadentis, what is the thing on which the church stands? If we don't get the Jesus piece right, what's the point of what we're doing? So I appreciate the centrality of Christology. And then I appreciate the situation of what to do when the state, in this case, the emperor, all of a sudden seems so friendly, all of a sudden seems so interested and wants to help the bishops get where they're going, because they were helped by the empire, by Constantine to get to Nicaea. They used the postal service at that time. It was not easy to travel, right? So they got room and board for the bishop and a couple of helpers. And, ancient times, not easy to travel. What do you do when you have this apparently friendly actor with a lot of power paying attention to your religious discussions? It's a challenge that we still have to face. So that is interesting to me.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. Also looking at how you describe it, that this is finding their way as they walk Yeah, we could probably say, well, this is still what we are doing, at least in a Mennonite understanding. It is not once and for all set in stone, but it is every time again finding a new, the right wording, the right philosophy, the right language to try to give words to something that is actually unspeakable, right? I see this wrestling as a process is super interesting and super encouraging. Andres, what is it for you?
Thank you. Thanks for this is already a very good start in the conversation. Let me start with location. The first time that I read the Creed was in a class on the Trinity in systematic theology. So even though I grew up in a Mennonite household and a Christian household in Colombia, I never encountered the Nicene Creed in a context of a liturgy. It was only up until the moment that I started to study theology that I encountered the Creed. So my relationship with the Creed from the beginning was very much in the theological reasoning sense, right? Like, where is the wisdom, or what are some key aspects that we can harvest in terms of how we describe Trinitarian frameworks, as Andrew was pointing at, and also very much in terms of how we would, Christology and how we understand Christology. When I think about the pure content, that's actually one of the key aspects for me in relation or having this background of Peace Church location, so to speak, right? So when I think about Christology in Trinitarian frame or this Trinitarian framework, I find that is a very useful and provocative way of offering a different account for how we understand peace. Let me give a couple of thoughts about this. So oftentimes, if we believe or if we're affirmed very much in line with what Andrew was saying, whether we call it substance, shared substance between God the parent and the Son, Jesus Christ, whether we describe that as a substance or a person, we affirm that there's an interconnection, or there are mutual characteristics, shared characteristics between the persons of the Trinity, so to speak, right? Now, for Peace Church tradition, one key characteristics of describing and understanding Christology has been the question of peace and nonviolence. How we symbolize, or how we identify Jesus Christ as Prince of Peace. How the witness of peace and nonviolence is present not just a calling for us as disciples, but actually very much present in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, we affirm that, and we have this logic of shared substance or shared personhood in terms of relationships, so to speak. What we're also affirming is that peace is at the very essence of who God is, right? So it's a very essential part and a very essential bit of who God's self is. And to me, that's a very important thing when it comes to our Peace Church tradition. We oftentimes have this discussion about the ethical component of peace, right? So if peace is just the consequence of the good works, so to speak, or if actually peace belongs to the very center of how we understand faith, but also how we understand God to be. Not just God's will, but the very essence of who God is. And I think that aspect really brings or allows that inner connection to bring peace very close to the heart of who God's self is. Now, the work of the Spirit, of course, is in enabling us as followers to join into that relationships, or into that community, as Andrew described, and to allow us to witness to that peace and then to be able to follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And I think that's the significance of participating in the Holy Spirit in these Trinitarian relations. That's a very important term for me. Another one, I am sure that I will not have time to unpack that, but it's the question of suffering and the image of a suffering God. If we believe that Jesus is incarnation, or if we believe that it's God incarnated, then there's a sense of very strong significance in the image of a God that suffers, and that has implications both for people who experience trauma and are dealing with experiences of extreme violence and injustice, while at the same time is an image that speaks loudly about what it means to be followers of Christ when you stand against powers and principalities. And the realistic logic, so not to protect or not to make suffering, not to be apologetic about suffering, but to understand that suffering can be one of the possibilities that you walk in as you want to step against powers or principalities in this world. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Andres. And it's actually, reading it in terms of the theology that we find in the Nicene Creed, one would then even, connecting to the suffering, one would even say a God that makes God's self vulnerable to suffering, right? Is actually what we see there. We don't know if this was the primary intention of the creed, but it is definitely something that Peace Church theology finds back in the creeds. And another thing that you mentioned is also interesting to note, that Mennonites, Anabaptist tradition, it is not in their liturgy that they every Sunday they would repeat the Nicene Creed, but it has become the ecumenical creed that we have learned participating in the ecumenical movement to use more often, and also to start to wrestle with it and to interpret it. Thank you so much for this first insight. So we see the connection of content and this very specific tradition that we have represented today with us. Now let's look a bit deeper into that, because there's also some criticism about the creed. Of course, it wouldn't be Mennonites if there was no criticism, I guess. So, from a specific Peace Church perspective, some Mennonite theologians have criticized that, there's so much about philosophy, ontology, and speculation about God. Where's the ethics? A tradition that stresses so much, following Jesus is really what makes a Christian, period. Now, why do we read and recite this creed if we do not find clear advice, what the ethics is that really is embedded in this specific understanding of God? So for the Peace Church, the visible discipleship was always so important. Would you agree with this criticism? That is to say that there's some aspects really missing and that could be the reason why Mennonites, this Anabaptist tradition of 500 years, has not used this creed so much as others have done. Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think I'd like to first address the question about the philosophical language or the ontological categories, because I'm not convinced by a blanket condemnation of the influence of philosophy, Hellenistic or otherwise, on an attempt to express Christology in a given time and place. Trying to find helpful categories for precision with the help of whatever categories are available to us, that's simply part of the inevitably contextual nature of theology. We all do it. Even when we use various languages, right now we're speaking in English, that makes a difference, right? So we use languages with varied symbolic systems to speak about God. And we know, Fernando, you said it before in a way, and Augustine said it before you did. We speak that we might be silent, not be silent, but the words that we use can never fully do justice to the mystery, right? So we live in this tension between the cataphatic and the apophatic, between preaching and silence, between word and breath. And I'm sure most of the bishops of Nicaea knew this as well as we do. So, said otherwise, a healthy Anabaptist skepticism about just how much words can do needn't be anti-philosophical or set up the ethical against the philosophical. To me, that's a false binary. It seems to me that theological categories such as the homoousion or divine persons or hypostatic union later on are simply a contextual response to the ambiguity of scriptural language. The gospel is communicated in the New Testament in narrative and metaphorical terms, and these are still the most evocative instruments available to us theologically. I mean, to me, the Lord's Prayer is where we stand together more than any creed. So this is where we live liturgically, this is where we live homiletically, but these ways of communicating are also necessarily multivalent. And sometimes we crave precision. We desire a kind of shorthand capable of summing up the narrative universe of the Gospels without annulling it. So to say that Christ is the Son of God or the Son of the human being can mean any number of things. And so philosophically inspired categories such as the homoousion can help us express what we've glimpsed in faith. And so the Creed of Nicaea, in fact, retains a narrative structure and overtly poetic language still. And the fact that it mixes both sorts of language is part of its appeal, I think. So I want to underline that the choice of the homoousion in the place of a scriptural metaphor results from a hermeneutical dilemma, the likes of which continues to be familiar to us in our current context. It's possible to use biblical language in ways that fall short of the good news of the gospel. So we can appreciate the soteriological reasoning behind the choice of the word. And I do think the reasoning is primarily soteriological, defending the economy of God. And at the same time, I can also see that the bishops of Nicaea did not fully flesh out the implications of choosing this contested word, homoousion, or indeed of the creed they were affirming, or of meeting in a time and place of nascent Christendom, right? So a creed or confession of faith always tries to express the basics in short form. It's kind of the way an FAQ works on a website, or vows do in a wedding ceremony. Nothing wrong with that. The problem emerges when the categories are evoked ahistorically and atemporally as the essence of our faith, essence. And that, not the language itself, becomes the problem. So circling back to Fernando's question, what's missing from the Creed of Nicaea? I think there is something missing. The straightforward argument for this was made by Tom Finger in his 1987 article, The Way to Nicaea. It was published in the Journal for Ecumenical Studies. And that essay was very formative for me. And it's often in the back of my mind when I think about the Creed of Nicaea. He argued that in the face of any creedal statements, Mennonite and presumably Anabaptist generally tend to ask two questions. First, what does the creed say? And second, how does the creed function? So if we focus on what it says, what's notable to me, perhaps more than what is actually said, it's what is lacking. It's the story of the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus. And if we focus on how it functions, on the material implications of this creed, that leads to complex deliberations, right? But Finger's ultimate point was that the emphasis that had been in the 2nd century on discipleship, the Spirit, and suffering that we've already heard, and that it's mentioned suffering, right? And Andrew mentioned the Spirit. And we all mentioned following Jesus. So these are visible, says Finger, only along the edges of the path that leads to Nicaea. And I love this notion of the edges of the path. That's where I walk when I walk on the road to Nicaea, or to any gathering of only male bishops or of only bishops, period, right? I'm on the edges of that path. So let me, though, rescue something interesting to me about the Creed of Nicaea, and that is, and I will distinguish the Creed of Nicaea from the later Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. I think we're kind of putting the two together. They're a little bit different, but the so-called Arian interpolations are interesting to me because I know that the conflict with Arius himself or with so-called Arianisms is hard to pin down, but still, the interpolation suggests to me that the matter at hand ultimately has to do with the question of materiality. And for the so-called Nicenes, such as Alexander or later Athanasius, the human body of the incarnate Logos is revelatory. So it's not necessary to love Athanasius or justify his machinations, to realize that this goes to the heart of Christology. Revelation is not just about the soul of Christ. It's about his entire incarnate person. And for Arius, such a focus on materiality probably would have suggested emanation, and he would have wanted to avoid this in favor of God's singularity and transcendence. This, circles back around to what Andrew was talking about in the beginning. So if this supposition is correct, divine representation is at the heart of the conflict. This is about Jesus truly serving as the icon of God, as the radiance of God's glory, as the exact representation of God's being, Hebrews 1:3. So if that materiality and iconicity is what the dispute about is at its core, and in some ways leads to the formation of the creed, this defense of the iconicity of Jesus is something that an Anabaptist sensibility can get behind. So it's not a matter about arguments about language or regulating others or excluding others, but a defense of the robust nature of God's work on our behalf in Christ by the Spirit. And that to me leads us right back again to the missing piece, in the creed that the Gospels do provide, the story of the life and the ministry and the teachings of Jesus, which in turn point us toward a particular counter-hegemonic, non-violent, enemy-loving way of being in the world.
Right.
And that is effaced whenever creeds, or only creeds, stand in too exclusively from the ambiguous, complex, messy stories of the gospel.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Nancy. This is I would love to hear more from you, because there's so much that you point to, it seems to me that this focusing on soteriology, which is actually really much the question, how is it possible that we are saved by this human being, Jesus, but it has to be a God, and so on. So then I was wrestling. Now, this Peace Church perspective is so much focused on the here and now. How do we live this faith? How do we witness to that? How do we witness to the truth that we believe in? So that makes it this is probably where this criticism comes from. Andrew, short comment from your side to this?
I don't know if I could do it short, but I'll try.
You
I
have
mean,
to.
what Nancy has provided, I mean, that's absolutely beautiful. And all I can say is a hearty amen to that. I think that one of the things that has been central to the Mennonite Anabaptist critique of the Nicene Creed is precisely the forgetfulness of the centrality of Jesus's life and ministry and teachings. And I think that that's the key point that causes angst about the creed itself. And so this, I mean, Walter Brueggemann has this wonderful caution, which also I think again, thinking about the context in which the creed emerges, he has this wonderful caution that talks about prosperity. He warns that prosperity causes amnesia, and amnesia leads to death. And so without remembering the life and teachings and ministry of Jesus, we also don't remember the alternative present, the radical and subversive realities of what Jesus was bringing about, and demonstrating and inviting people to participate in the midst of empire, at that time the Roman Empire, right? And so if we don't remember that, we forget this subversive alternative reality that was already beginning to be witnessed to, and to which we were invited to participate in. And that's a significant element, because what the creed ended up doing, in my opinion, was it introduced this, what I would describe as a birth to death Christology, right? So this notion of Christology was present and front and center within the creed, but it introduced this idea of that Jesus arrived, was born to die. And so we have this birth to death Christology without forgetting the significance of the life that Jesus lived and the teachings that Jesus taught, and the invitation that he offered to us to participate in what he was talking about as an alternative counter witness to empire that ultimately led to death. That's very different than this idea of coming to die, right? And so that whole thing, that's the piece I think that for Mennonites has been one of the issues that has caused angst about the creed. And going back to Finger, I mean, one of the things that Tom Finger kind of highlights is precisely the way in which those creeds function. And if you have this birth to death Christology, that has shaped 1700 years of how the Christian message, that soteriological message, has been interpreted and articulated. But Finger also highlights that creeds and confessions can, and sometimes have, and especially within the Mennonite tradition, which we often forget, can also serve as unifying documents, which is also a very significant component, I think.
Right. Now that's definitely the function that we see today in the World Council of Churches, in the ecumenical movement in general. But hey, let's be a bit more skeptical and critical here, also to pay attention to that, Andres. Before I come to you. Let me combine this with this whole skepticism from Mennonites, Peace Church tradition. I mean, one thing is that we just heard is like how beautiful it is for 1,700 years and so on. Mennonites, as said, have always been skeptical when it comes to set in stone wording of the truth of the gospel, right? And that's what we have here, and say like, no, you have to find your own words. You have to interpret it yourself, you know, and make it, own it, and not just repeat it, we're doing it here. Combined with that was, of course, the skepticism that I mentioned in the beginning. You know, there was always, a tradition that really pleads for the clear separation of church and state. It was also looking back into the political context that we saw the creed appearing. Say like, okay, man, that was exactly the time that we call the Constantinian shift. This is when we see a development of the ancient church from a persecuted minority, you know, moving to an accepted, tolerated group within the Roman Empire, becoming a state religion. Imagine, and this is, I mean, that's also our way of reading church history and the history of theology. This is when we see a new way of doing theology, because the perspective has switched. So here we have an emperor who's inviting the bishops and basically deciding on what the unifying theology is, overdoing it now. What do Mennonites do with that, Andres?
Well, I was thinking about speaking about it in a different moment, but I think that's a fair representation. I think we have a lot of this criticism, and I think you are pointing out in the right way, Fernando, has to do a lot with self-representation of Mennonites and Anabaptists, right? So there's a tendency, that's my impression, that we have of as an Anabaptist Mennonites, that's the we that I'm using here, to explain who we are based on who we are not. So the differences, distinctions to be made, right? So whenever we claim radical Reformation, history of the radical Reformation, we want to signal how different we were from the other streams of Reformation, or how distinctive we were. And in this distinctiveness, of course, comes questions about adult baptism, non-resistance, non-conformist approaches, peace as a whole thing, the church as a community of believers. So all these things that we gather from the radical Reformation and so on and so forth. And I think there's a trend that continues to some extent, right? Like we keep trying to highlight the aspects that we distance ourselves from, or that we're distinctive from, so to speak. At times that has led to separation, and at times it just leads to very clear differentiation between us and other church families and denominations or traditions and so on. There's a moment that almost to argue in favor of Trinitarian language, or for Nicaea, or to argue for some of the more common and shared church history foundation, so to speak, we need to make a huge bridge theologically. Like we need to make a lot of argumentations and prove why we're making that connection. So it's an interesting thing of how we perceive ourselves, and I think that continues. The other thing which I think plays still a key function is the language that we use between orthodoxy as the right belief and orthopraxis, right? And how we have emphasized in the Mennonite stream or peace theology stream so much this idea of the right, or the right actions, not just the right belief, but also the ways of acting rightly in the world. And that's where we have this ethical dimension that very much, as Nancy described, this is how I heard you, Nancy, it can never be disconnected from what we believe. And that's sometimes where we fall into the trap. We ourselves fall into the trap as Mennonites and Anabaptists, that we focus just on the orthopraxis dimension, that's the most important thing to us, and that we sort of leave aside this whole idea of speaking about God or reasoning about God. Like that's a different thing that we do not tend to do. So I find that brings us into this problem or this complexity, and the skepticism, as you described, Fernando, of using the language among historic peace churches and other free churches is very common to hear the language. We're non-creedal church, right? Like we do not subscribe to creeds. We allowed in the moment of baptism, adult baptism, to allow the believer to express faith in their own words as a way to actually articulate that, and I find that interesting. But I find it has to do a lot with this self-representation. Now, to come back to the creed, I can speak more about the Constantinian shift at a different moment, but with regards to the creed, I think this question of embodiment both as a believer, as a disciple is missing, but also as a church. In the addition later, when we have the Catholic, the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church and so on and so forth, there's a description of what the church, the scriptures of what the church is, ecclesiologically, not so much about the calling or the vocation of the church, right? And that's so this embodiment is not just felt in the incarnation, so to speak, but also in what eventually we will interpret as the body of Christ in terms of who we are as a community. So I find that dimension, critically looking, is somewhat missing. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Friends, time is running. Let me quickly, before Nancy and Andrew have another opportunity to add short comments. We have questions from the audience here. One question has already been answered, basically, Joseph Dasan Tokwala. So the Nicene Creed is not regularly, I would say, in general, not used in the worship services. It is, as I said before, it is becoming, for those churches who are involved in the ecumenical movement, congregations, it is more known now. For example, in the German Mennonite hymnal, you will find it. And you will find also the other creeds. So that 100 years ago, that would have been impossible. That's probably not. And again, it's not that Mennonites were against it. It was just like not considered to be so relevant. It was more relevant and more important that you find your own words to express this faith. Now we have discussed already what the pros and cons of that is. Do we place ourselves in the community of believers globally, and we share this confession of faith? Yes, there's something very rich to be remembered there, and very, very precious, let's say, that this is common language. Even when I come from Africa or Asia, Latin America, I can, if I study hard enough, and that's a challenge also for Europeans, to understand what the creed really means. But seeing that, as Nancy, I heard you saying, seeing that more as an invitation to, again, use that way, what these theologians in the ancient church, what they have done, use that as an invitation to then, on the basis of what they did, do that yourself, now find new words. And we have so many great new expressions of our common faith. The other question that I read here is, what does the faith, this is Carmelo Santos, what does the faith of Nicaea have to offer to the contemporary struggle of the churches against authoritarian regimes and populist movements, and usurp the language of faith to justify unjust practices, laws, etc.? Very good question, Carmelo. Thank you for that. Nancy, do you want to speak to that?
Well, as I was hearing everybody, what came to my mind were more questions and answers, really. Questions that are opened up by our discussion. I was thinking, and maybe Carmelo's question connects to this. What are the traps? What are the traps that we find ourselves enmeshed in now? How to face them? Because we are enmeshed in Christendom practices. We can't purely say, oh, I'm outside of this. If we are in kind of Christian majority or Christian dominant or Christian heritage type countries, we often are enmeshed in these privileges. What do we do? I was recently in Germany, and they had Pfingstmontag. They had the Monday after Pentecost as a holiday. And I was like, wow, I love this. Wish I had Pfingstmontag. What do we do with this? How are we enmeshed? And then at the same time, how do we survive if we're in places of persecution? Because that's also happening, right? And I don't want to idealize persecution or suffering, or, some of those bishops at Nicaea have actually on their bodies imprinted their suffering, the persecution that had happened, right? So what about suffering? Also, and then what is our gift to the wide, as Anabaptists, what is our gift to the wider body? Not separating ourselves from the wider body, but saying, look, we have a certain perspective that is a reminder. We are reminded by the wider body of a continuity in faith that is valuable to us, and we belong to this bigger story. But we also have a particularity to bring, and this insistence on the way of Jesus, peace, counter-hegemonic stances. And in that gift, I think there is a perhaps beginning of an answer to the question that Carmelo was bringing up
Right.
about how to face things right now.
Right. There's also in the chat. I mean, you can all follow that. The question. This phrase that we have there, and Jesus who suffered under Pontius Pilate. I mean, there's this, and Andres has pointed to that. There's this clear hint of the suffering. So it is not at all that we can say also as Mennonites that that is all the way of the cross basically, and the cost of discipleship is neglected. No, it's not. If you read it carefully, I mean, every single word counts in a confession that you want to use as a unifying statement. I mean, so that this again brings us to this procedure. Andrew, anything you want to add here?
I think that
Shortly.
that component of suffering within the creed also recognizes or highlights how suffering isn't the end of the story,
Right.
and how hope plays a significant factor in understanding not only the life, but also the death, the suffering, but also the resurrection, right? That there's hope that is not the end of the story. And I think that is an important element. And that's been within kind of the Mennonite Anabaptist history. I think that that's been a significant component and something in which we actually can have confidence in, that even if there is suffering, and this is not to idealize suffering or to suggest that suffering is in any way good, but it's also recognizing that God is still and will still be at work in and through that. And I think that for Mennonites, I think an internal or intra critique for Mennonites, I think, is crucial in this component as well, is that this idea rests on the connection between Jesus and the immanent Trinity. Within Mennonites, there's been a strong kind of horizontal understanding of Jesus and the significance of Jesus, and Jesus as a good example that we need to follow, etc. But that is given significance precisely because he is the Son of God,
Right.
that vertical, that immanent relationship within the Godhead. And if we don't remember that, then Jesus just simply becomes another good example among others.
Yeah, and it's, Andrew, it's not just remembering that, but also maybe that's what you want to say, believing
Right.
that, this is really what makes it. And I would say to finalize this thought, that it is very important for the Mennonite Church, the believers, the Peace Church tradition and so on, to understand how much this theological foundation is so important to strengthen the ethical ideas of what it means to be Christian. So, as Nancy, you said it earlier, don't tear that apart. Put that together, because it is one. This is what makes the Christian faith so meaningful and so rich. But also, as Andres has started this conversation, and thank you, Andres, for pointing to the suffering aspect, that this may come with a cost. This is not a walk in the park, this Christian faith. This is an invitation to of course, live your life in its fullest sense, and be blessed with all the blessings that we have. But be prepared also to witness and to confess in political struggles, when it's in times of injustice, and then it might become costly. Yes, but that don't be surprised, but also don't be afraid of that. This is because your God has chosen to become human in order to live through that. So suffering is not the end, as you say, Andrew. Father Octavian, our time is up. I'm so sorry. This is super interesting. I enjoy this. Thank you so much, speakers. But over to you, Father.
Thank you very much on behalf of the World Council of Churches, and I wish to express my heartfelt thanks, first of all, to you, Reverend Professor Dr. Fernando Enns, for moderating today's event. My sincere gratitude also goes to all the speakers and also to Cesar Garcia, the General Secretary of the Mennonite World Conference, and the Chair of the Conference of Secretaries of Christian Communions for the close collaboration that made this webinar possible. We are grateful to all participants for your interest and questions. The next webinar in this series will take place in September, most probably towards the end of the month, organized jointly with the World Methodist Council on the theme, "We believe in one God, maker of heaven and earth, confessing, celebrating, and working together as members in God's household." We look forward to continuing this journey of dialogue and reflection with you in the lead up with the Faith and Order World Conference this October in Egypt. Stay tuned and thank you once again.